So, in this episode, we're going to take a look at how your marketing strategy needs to respond to those big career transitions and milestones, from bringing on an associate or a partner or opening even a new office. We'll look at how to prepare your practice for a smooth transition, including communication strategies to maintain patient trust. Dr. Klempner, thank you for joining me again.
Oh, happy to be back.
All right, so let's start this. Are there specific considerations you take into account when you're talking with a practice that's well established?
Well, there are, and as I said in the last episode, there are still these basic areas that we need to start from, which is we need to plan for common mid-career transitions and milestones.
Mhm.
We also need to capitalize. Our goal is to capitalize on those opportunities to help grow the practice. That's typically the reason for the transition.
Right.
But at the same time, we also need to be aware of some of the risk factors and to evaluate a strategy to help us reduce those risks.
Mhm. So, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned in my intro, one of those common milestones of that mid career ortho includes bringing on an associate. So, what are the considerations you take in that case?
So, for sure, bringing on associate is probably the most common of those milestones.
Mhm.
But, as you mentioned, there are others as well. And, you know, whether you're bringing an associate in as an associate as the end game
Mhm.
or as a partner as the end game, that could change the strategy as well. Um, as well as opening a new office or purchasing somebody else's office. So, where would you like to begin?
Well, let's start with that associate. What, because you talked to the last episode about you were working with an oral surgeon who you referred a patient to as a long-standing relationship, and then the patient gets over there and it's a new doctor. It's a new, I'm guessing it was an associate, and that
Hmm.
you were a little taken off guard by that and not having been introduced, and so the patient's the one who's telling you. So let's talk about bringing on a new associate and avoiding that kind of problem for your referring doctors too.
Well, a lot has to do with looping in the referring doctors for sure in the communication process. So, as I said before, there needs to be an organized way of um, rolling out the new associate to all of the different stakeholders, and it needs to be done in order. You don't want your referring doctors to be, the second person to know. You don't want them hearing from their patients that, oh, I saw some new guy instead of the one that you referred me to. That's never a good practice builder. So we want to try to minimize the disruption that can occur when bringing someone in. So you can
Mhm.
imagine bringing in a new doctor, and I've gone through this process, so I can tell you from experience
Okay.
that when you bring in a new doctor, there are a lot of misconceptions that go on.
Mhm.
Patients are concerned. Is the old doctor, old meaning established doctor,
Right.
uh, i- is he leaving?
Hmm.
Is there going to be like a bait and switch here? Wait a
Right.
minute, I thought I was getting this guy, and now I'm getting this guy.
Yeah.
Um, having patients schedule with the typically younger associate is sometimes challenging unless you
Hmm.
establish some credibility there so that nobody wants to make an appointment.
Right.
That's something that we need to mitigate as well. So what's important is communicating to your patients and your team and your staff and referring doctors and the community
Hmm.
how you pick this individual. What is special about them? Why did I choose this one? What do they bring to the table? And, when you think about it, what patients really are looking for when you drill it all down is what's in it for me?
Yeah.
How does this affect me? That's what they're concerned about. So you want to build in as much benefit to the patient as possible in the communication. Some examples might be, and now we can now have extended after school appointments,
Mm.
something that's a
Yeah.
pain point for most. Or now we're open Saturdays, whereas we
Right.
weren't before.
Right.
So How you communicate it and what you communicate in is so important when bringing in, an associate. And the order, as I said, is also critical as well. Sometimes, though, when you're bringing in a partner
Mhm.
versus an associate, well, that sometimes would necessitate a brand change.
Okay.
I'll use me as an example. For a long time, my practice was Leon Klempner, DDS orthodontist.
Hmm.
So for 20 years, I built this brand that was based on Leon Klempner. People would know Leon Klempner as the name. People would ask for Leon Klempner.
Yep.
Referring docs would refer to Leon Klempner.
Hmm.
So now you bring in a potential partner. Well, you have to establish that credibility. And if the name of the practice is Leon Klempner Orthodontics, that's not going to work in the long term.
Ah, okay.
So when you have a partner, now you have to think about a rebrand.
Hmm.
Something more genetic that doesn't include the senior doctor's name so that, you could build that brand. So
Hmm.
a lot of, interesting things that are important to pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so before we kind of talk about the marketing strategies for each of these transitions, let's talk about the last one that you mentioned earlier, and that transition that you mentioned earlier, and that is taking over another orthodontist practice who is retiring as a second location. How does that, or even opening a new office, how does that differ from bringing on that new doctor?
Well, I mean, when you're purchasing an existing practice,
Hmm.
um, you're uh, again paying much for the goodwill of that particular practice.
Hmm.
It's important that those patients that are coming into your practice now are transferred over and the trust is transferred over so that they'll bring their siblings so that the practice will continue. So again, the handoff is so important in terms of the communication. Why I'm selling to this particular doctor. So
Hmm.
you can't let the seller off the hook here if you're the buyer.
Okay.
It's in your best interest to have that seller transfer that trust over, jointly communicate why in a letter.
Hmm.
Have everybody understand why and how it's done. It's almost like, a handoff in football or passing the baton in a relay race. You want to emphasize, how the retiring doctor is working hand in hand for a smooth transition. Again, what's in it for me is what the
Right.
patients are thinking about. Okay,
Hmm.
how's he going to know what's the next step or what we've been talking about,
Yeah.
or the treatment plan. Am I going to be now, starting all over again? We need to mitigate all of those fears and concerns. And that could be done with effective communication, but it needs to be done in an orderly, thought out process. And that's the critical area there. And
Okay.
again,
Yeah.
this oftentimes, purchasing a practice now, it has a different name. You're going to have to, think about a brand change
Right.
and similar to a new practice.
Okay.
When you're opening a second location, similar marketing strategies, making sure your digital assets are in place, your Google profile, your location, so that Google knows that you have another location.
So let's talk about kind of the marketing perspective, the the process there. So let's start with a new doctor. So whether that be an associate or partner. And I'm imagining there's little differences because you did talk before about how there are differences in your strategy to create that trust. What should those what should those doctors be doing in terms of their marketing?
Well, whenever our team encounters these transitional scenarios,
Hmm.
we always take a step back
Hmm.
to reestablish the differentiated value, the value proposition of the practice between the two doctors. Because sometimes, that changes. So the next step is to incorporate that differentiator and look at the website. Does it reflect that? Is it consistent? Because things change. If it's an associate, you need to add a bio page. You need to highlight their photograph. So you need to make some changes on your digital properties, on the website and on social, so that they're also involved. So it's important that, in either scenario, when you're dealing with these types of transitions, you want to plan for both the internal and the external marketing. That means you have to think about your current patients, your referring doctors, the staff, as well as attracting new patients. So for the first group, you want to keep confidence in the practice, reduce, high anxieties, for example. And in the latter, you want to focus on brand awareness of the doctor or the location. And this can be done with advertising, digital advertising, or building reviews.
Okay. And then let's talk about the buying a retiring doctor's practice. What are some of your recommendations there on the marketing side?
Well, I mean, it's similar in terms of, the goal is we want to grow the practice.
Hmm.
So, we want to transfer the trust over. We want to make sure that all of our digital properties are reflecting the new practice.
Hmm.
We want to highlight in our communication how this benefits their current patients. So, and then we want to go back and make sure that the website, the Facebook ads, the traffic ads, the Google paid ads, everything is reflective of the new practice. It's an opportunity.
Yeah.
We look at these events and these milestones as opportunities. This is an opportunity to showcase your practice to the community.
Hmm.
That's the way we look at it. So you need to capitalize on it. They don't happen that often in your
Right.
practice where something changes. It's not like you bought a new scanner and okay, you'd say, oh, look, at
It's
some
hard to
point
market
that was,
that to
yeah,
externally.
at some point that was a big deal. No
Right.
more goopy impressions, that type of thing.
Hmm.
But not anymore. So,
Yeah.
not everybody has a scanner, but
Yeah.
not everybody brings on an associate, opens up another practice.
Hmm.
These are ways of highlighting your differentiator
Hmm.
and your footprint in the community.
Yeah.
And we want to mitigate all of the negatives as well with good communications as well.
Yeah. You mentioned, making sure your website's on point and your social media. If you're taking, if you're buying a practice, that practice probably had its own website, probably had its own social media channels. What should you do with those old digital properties?
Well, that's a really good question, and that depends on the individual case.
Okay.
There are instances where there's quite a distance between the two communities,
Hmm.
and in those cases, that if they're well established, then we don't want to disrupt things too much. So
Hmm.
we might want to do some branding and keep another website.
Okay.
That you don't necessarily need to consolidate.
Hmm.
But in more instances than not, it's easier to just fold it in and transfer as much of the juice to
Hmm.
the main practice. But it really varies from practice to practice on an individual basis. The other thing is the marketing. The different communities have different styles.
Yeah.
And, as marketers, we don't often talk about this, but, we have clients that are, in the very rural areas of the Midwest, and we have clients in LA and in Manhattan.
Hmm.
And the marketing has to be different. It
Yeah.
has to reflect the personality of the location that you're
Hmm.
dealing with. And, so many times we see that not paid attention to and it backfires. So being very sensitive to the community that you're dealing with. And I know orthodontists, this has come up many times where they want to make sure that it's not too showy depending on their personality.
Yeah.
So we have to work within the personality of the orthodontist as well as the personality, so to speak, of the
Yeah.
community, so that we find that fine line that drives new patients in, but doesn't ruffle any feathers, doesn't denigrate their competitors or
Hmm.
anything like that.
Yeah. Okay, so the last transition we want to talk about is that opening that new practice, that satellite, that new office. And like you said, like that's a big moment for a practice. It's an opportunity to get in front of the community in a new way because it's not just getting a scanner anymore, which I'm sorry is not big news, like you said. So what should they be doing? What should they be doing in terms of marketing, and what does this moment lend itself to?
Well, it's an opportunity now to address the highlights and the differentiators of the practice. So if we've gone through the process of establishing a value proposition that is deliverable,
Mm-hmm.
that the community wants, that their competitors are not advertising, at least, even if they are doing it, they're not promoting it.
Hmm.
Well, that's our lane, that's our opportunity. And any of the transitions give us that opportunity to go out and express that. The other
Hmm.
thing is, everything isn't all digital.
Yeah.
You can't delegate certain things to an external marketing company. As much as you'd like, I'm speaking to the orthodontists out there, as much as you'd like to say, okay, I'm going to pay you, you do everything, and,
Hmm.
and, and I'm done. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It's got to be a partnership, and you still have to pay attention to the community and to the dentists. All too often, orthodontists are writing off their general dentists because
Yeah.
they're doing aligners, they're competitors. I don't know. There's a laundry list of things
Yeah.
that annoy
Yes.
orthodontists about
Yes.
referring dentists.
Yes.
However, they refer and they're important for the lifeline of the practice. We want to get our new patients, particularly in this environment. This is a very competitive environment we're in right now.
Yeah.
Some practices are struggling,
Yeah.
and it's important that we put all our tentacles out. We want them from all directions, including the general dentist. We want to be in the community. We want to support the local schools. We want to be at the local fairs. We still want to be doing all of those things.
Hmm.
And if dropping off bagels counts and works in your area, then you do those bagel
Yeah.
runs. But the connection with the general dentist is still very important. And I remember in my own practice, I had a list
Hmm.
and a spreadsheet, and
Yeah.
I have my top 10 referrers on the spreadsheet. And once a month, I would make a point of making sure I made contact with each one of those. And, maybe it was a patient that I saw that day. What
Hmm.
great opportunity. Hey, I
Yeah.
saw Johnny. I'm a little concerned about his hygiene. I talked to mom that maybe it might be a good idea for them to come in and see you, or maybe your hygienist could work with them. I
Hmm.
hate to see him get marks on his teeth. I'd really
Right.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
That's a contact. That's not only a contact, but that's showing the dentist that you care about them.
Hmm.
And invariably, even if the doc wasn't referring a lot of patients, after a phone call from that, a couple of days later, I'd get a referral.
Ah.
You know,
Yeah.
so it counts. It
Yeah.
counts. So
Yeah.
we need to make a conscious effort to maintain those relationships as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah. You want to be top of mind.
You
And
want to be top of mind.
yeah.
That's exactly it. And
Yeah.
it's competitive right now
Hmm.
and getting more and more competitive.
Yeah.
The truth of the matter is, Allison, and I hate to say it, but from being in this is our 13th year.
Yeah.
So I have a pretty good pulse on what's going on in the orthodontic field,
Hmm.
and we get a lot of data. We have the gauge data of our patients,
Hmm.
so I see all of the numbers. The sad reality is that you can no longer be a plain vanilla orthodontist. You can't just put your shingle out and open your office and expect to do well in this environment. Everybody is marketing up.
Yeah.
Everybody is understanding that it's competitive and they need to carve out their share in the community, or their practice will be on the decline. So, all the things that we've been talking about all serve in that direction, but the transitions really give us that opportunity to highlight um, things that oftentimes might go under the radar.
Speaking of kind of those transitions, allowing you to highlight things that might have been going under the radar, what about for a practice who is kind of that mid-career point and doesn't like their brand? or doesn't feel like it's serving them anymore. They're tired of it, they've outgrown it, or it just doesn't fit anymore. And what would your advice be to them if they're at that mid-career point? And maybe they do have a transition, maybe they don't.
Yeah, we get a lot of that.
You
We
do?
get a
Okay.
lot of that. And the reason we get a lot of it is because a lot of practices have gone flat.
Hmm.
And up until now, they felt that they didn't really need it. It,
Yeah.
it. it was something that wasn't that important. They already have a website that they
Hmm.
created, years ago,
Hmm.
and they have a logo that, they picked out of a book somewhere,
Right.
and, they felt, oh, I've got it covered. I've got it
Hmm.
covered. I've tried Facebook, and, I have an assistant that is good on Facebook, so she's tried that. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
And basically, they come to us out of necessity,
Mm.
and they're willing to listen at that point.
Okay.
And to answer your question, we start from the beginning.
Mm.
Okay, we go through the differentiation exercise. Let's talk about it. What is it in your community that the patients want? What is it that you can consistently deliver upon? What is it that your competition is not doing? And then we just develop a branding document. From that, we develop a meaningful logo and a website that's
Mhm.
built for SEO and conversion from the bottom up. And Google ads,
Yeah.
Facebook ads follow, reviews follow. So we have a program basically that covers all of these things, and they
Mm.
need to be covered.
Yeah.
If you don't cover them, for example, if you don't pay attention to your reviews, then everything you're doing to build your brand gets sabotaged
Yeah.
because digital natives look at reviews,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
They look at reviews for
Yep.
restaurants, they look at reviews for orthodontists as well.
Hmm.
And if your competitors have 100 or 200 and you have 3 or 4 or 10 or 20, it's not enough.
Yep.
And we
Absolutely.
all know it,
Yep.
those reviews are a game
Hmm.
more than anything else. They don't necessarily reflect the ones with the best
Right.
reviews of the best orthodontists. That
Yes.
doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
But you got to play the game.
Yep.
So, we have a system of
Hmm.
building reviews.
Hmm.
So we need to mitigate the possible negative reviews. That's the other
Right.
thing. If you don't have a lot of positive reviews, you get a negative review, it hurts. If you have a lot of positive reviews, you get one negative review, people write that off as, well, that's just a one-off type of thing. So,
Yeah.
consistency and covering all of the bases. And we like to talk about a holistic approach.
Mhm.
That's what we talk about.
Okay. Well, Dr. Klepner, thank you so much for all your insight, and we'll have you back for our next episode where we're going to talk about that transitioning out phase, that end of career and handing your practice off to someone else or closing
Hey,
up.
I've been
Thank
there too, so I'm looking
All
forward to
right.
it.
Excellent. All right. Thank you. As always, thank you for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Orthodontic Products Podcast to keep up with the latest episodes. And be sure to check out orthodonticproductsonline.com to keep up with the latest industry news. Until next time, take care.